Director of the Air Transport Action Group, and Aaron Robinson, Vice President of Sustainable Aviation Fuel US at International Airlines Group, for a panel discussion on the future of sustainable aviation fuel.
Everyone, welcome. I had to get up so they could put that other chair. I thought about just staying, but great to have you all here. So we just had such a fantastic conversation about what needs to happen and how to keep the momentum going. And I can't think of a better industry now to focus on, because often airlines who comes here always has the conversation, is it worth the CO2 emissions to make the trip to go to a conference like this? So I think it's really important. So let's kick off on maybe, Haldane, if you could talk to us about, when people talk about, there's my mic, I thought it was off for a second. When people are talking about what's happening in the air industry, just bring us up to date. Where are we with the transition? Is it happening? How is it happening? Just give us, sort of set the table for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks very much for having us to come and speak. And it's really great for foreign policy to have a specific discussion on aviation, because when we're talking about the energy transition, often the big picture of energy transition sort of dwarfs out what is a fairly small part of it, but it's big for us, and it's a really important part of the discussion, because that connection is really important. Bringing people together is really important. That's what we do every day. So if you look back at where we've come with aviation's energy transition, and specifically around sustainable aviation fuel, which is one of the energy options for us in the future, but the main one. Back in 2008, 747 flew from London to Amsterdam with first sort of commercial aircraft flight on biofuel. That was really the kickstart to a lot of work that then went on for the next 3 years, with thousands of engineers and scientists across not only the aviation space but the energy space, making sure that we could do it safely, making sure that there was certification process to ensure that we could fly commercially on that. We got that in 2011, 2016, the first daily supply of SAF into, I think it was San Francisco Airport at that time. So we're in the process of starting the energy transition. We've done a lot of groundwork. We've set the foundations for this. We've got 7 different pathways that can be used for sustainable aviation fuel. Another 7 or 8 in the pipeline to be certified, which gives us a menu of different options for where we can get these new fuels from. But importantly, because we were quite late to the game, we were able to learn from some of the mistakes of the first generation of biofuels that were used in road transport and avoid them. So we were able to do this in a much more cohesive and responsible way.
Which is nice when you're able to leapfrog and avoid that. And it's so important to do that. Aaron, do you want to address the challenges when you're talking about this? Because I don't know if you're all sitting there, but I'm thinking, have I been on a plane recently with biofuel? I mean, it's sort of, not something that we're immediately aware of as consumers, but it's a delicate thing when you're talking about making a transition for something like flying, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. Just as background for the audience, most people have probably not heard of my company, and that's quite intentional. So International Airlines Group is a European holding company. We've got 5 airlines underneath us. The ones you've probably heard of here in the U.S. are mainly British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus. And you're right, the consumer piece, the customer-facing piece of this is really important. I mean, last year our airlines used 18 million gallons of SAF on our flights. All of that was in London or in Spain. This year we're adding new deliveries that we're taking here in the U.S. as well. But you're right, there's a huge communications challenge in this space. And I think the issue in it inherently is we want it to be available. We want it to be in there, in the system, but to do that efficiently and effectively means making it just like the fossil jet fuel we use. And that, in the end, means making it invisible, which then makes it very difficult to go and show to customers, to get them excited about it. And I think one challenge, really, in this space is raising money for this. Raising money to go and build lots of new facilities is incredibly difficult. But to me, that's not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is how do we excite the public to get them to realize that just like electric vehicles, just like solar and wind energy, there is a better option here. There's a better path forward we have, but if they can't see it and visualize it, They're not going to go and demand that solution as actively to a policymaker who can then go and create that funding to enable, in fact, that industry to prosper and grow.
That's so interesting, yeah, because it doesn't look any different to us walking up the gate, right? I mean, it's not the new model. You don't see your neighbor with it in the driveway and get curious about it. Jeremy, we just had an acronym in there, I think. I know, hello. we're quite spread out. What do we need to know about the innovations happening on that side of the equation? And we just talked about SAF, I think, but for those of us who are not familiar, what's the pipeline look like?
No, it's a good question, and I think Haldane already touched on it a little bit. There are many different ways of making SAF today. So Ecoservice uses a pathway called HEFA, which is where we're using organic fats, oils, and greases, like used cooking oil from restaurants. That's one pathway, and we started producing that at industrial scale today, so that is available in planes today. Like, for example, we've recently done some work with British Airways in that sense. But that's not the only pathway. There are other ways of producing SAF. Another one is to convert alcohol to jet fuel. So that's an industry which is taking off in the US, pun intended, because the US has a lot of ethanol. And we are also part of that journey because we are also developing how to convert agricultural waste, the cellulose in that, into alcohol. So I would say that's the technology for tomorrow. And then you have the technologies for the future. Some of those are gasification. You can gasify woody biomass. We're also working on that technology side. But then eventually we'll also get to using electricity to make fuel, like eSAF. So what I'm trying to paint here is a picture that there is no one way of making SAF. There are very many ways, but there are ways that you can deploy today while you start planning for the SAF of the future.
I imagine that's very important because we're talking about a global industry, and so access to materials, I would imagine, varies. So it sounds like you're saying you can lean into the supply where you are. Is that right?
That is exactly right. So there are parts of the globe that are maybe feedstock poor, but energy rich. So depending on where you are in that spectrum, you use maybe your biomass, maybe you use your agricultural waste, but if you are energy rich, you're making eSAF. And look, jet fuel, there's only one standard, there's one specification globally. Flying is a global business, so we need global supply and global production to address this.
Yeah, Haldane, go
Maybe
pick that
just
up.
to add into that as well, and one of the other things that was a major consideration for us is that we could basically start replacing the current fossil jet fuel supply with sustainable aviation fuel bit by bit. It's a drop-in fuel. And so if you fly out of Los Angeles, if you fly out of San Francisco and many other airports worldwide, there will be a very small portion of SAF in your tank across the fleet. The important thing there is that we didn't have to replace aircraft. You know, we could use it in today's aircraft because we've got 25,000 jets flying around the world today. They're going to have a lifespan of 25 years, and we don't want to have to throw them away because we need a new type of energy supply. So being able to replace that bit by bit as supply comes on board, whilst keeping the current aircraft, the current fueling systems and everything else in place, but with a different type of fuel, that was really important.
I could see a short-term and long-term economic challenge, perhaps, because adaptation first sometimes can be costly, and then if everyone's on board, you commoditize it and push it down. I don't know if that's the dynamic that's at play here. What about adaptation? Do we have industry consensus, and both of you can address this, around that, or is this the case? Because when I'm a business reporter by trade, and whenever we talk about airlines, it's a thin profit margin, even though we don't feel it as customers maybe, but it's tough. You have to really watch your costs. It's demanding and competition is fierce. So how is that playing into this transition? Yeah,
and this makes it quite challenging because depending on where in the world you buy it, SAF could be double the price of fossil jet fuel. It could be maybe 5x potentially. So you can see pretty quickly.
So it is more expensive.
It is more expensive right now. Okay. I think it will always be more expensive because it's a better product, right? But the outcome of that is the adoption rates vary dramatically around the world. And even, let's take the United States as an example. Some airlines are pushing forward quite aggressively on it. Others are sitting back and saying, I'm going to let someone else figure out and solve the problem for me, right? There's a competitive dynamic there that says, if I take one step forward, that's great, that costs me, I'm decarbonizing. I'm not going to go and take a second step until all of my competitors are also taking that first step as well. And that leads to slower action.
It could lead to paralysis.
It can lead to paralysis, yeah. And it's part of why the industry has been slow to develop. But now, just to give it some sense of scale, so for our airlines, in 22, we increased our SAF use 5x. 23 was 5x. This year is going to be 3.5x. So that's getting some quite exponential growth. Last year we were third in the world in terms of SAF use. This year we're going to hit 2% level. So, we're going to be moving quite aggressively and adding it. The challenge is, how do we do that financially if our competitors are not? In Europe, there's mandates in place to try and break that logjam. And so everyone has to start adopting simultaneously.
This is where regulation matters. And the first mover disadvantage has come up quite often throughout these conversations and also over on the UN, if any of you have attended that. It's an issue when you're talking about trying to get industry on board. Haldane, how is your membership talking about that or thinking about that?
Yeah, so my membership covers the entire aviation sector. Airlines, like the IAG group, but also all the other airlines in the world, airports, air traffic management, the makers of aircraft like Boeing and Airbus, all members, and we're all aligned on the way forward with this. So we have a global industry goal of net zero carbon by 2050. It's a real challenge to get the industry, to agree on that. We need to do a homework to figure out how we would make that happen before we would adopt it, but we did. And we then spent a year convincing the world's governments to do that as well. So we have a specialized UN agency that looks after international civil aviation, and those governments also adopted net zero 2050 as a goal. So the governments are on board with that. A year after that, they also adopted a goal specific to the type of fuel we can use. So that really is where some of these global policy moves can start taking place. And that really sends a signal in an international sense to governments around the world to start thinking about the type of policy measures that they can put in place to help us with that transition. Because I think everybody recognizes we as industry can't do it by ourselves. We need that policy support in a range of different ways. This is a multilateral system. You have different opportunities and capabilities around the world as well in different countries. And so some of them will support in different ways. But that's a really important part of the process.
It's complex. It's a complex matrix, the airline industry. Jeremy, does that help you in terms of development? I'm imagining, and when you're talking to investors or raising capital, to know that you have some forecast on demand must be incredibly important.
Yes, absolutely. Policy is super important in this space. And I think the differences in policies, we talked about the mandate in Europe, that gives a lot of certainty in terms of demand. It's clear, it's 2% starting in January. That's great. You can start building your refineries, you can start investing towards that demand. In the United States, you have the Clean Fuel Producer Credit from the IRA. That gives financial incentives to produce the fuel. You could even have both. You could have a mandate and an incentive. Some parts of the world have a levy. Singapore is introducing a levy on passengers. But all of these signals help understand what the demand looks like and therefore, to an extent, de-risk the investment in that sector. And they've been hugely successful. The uptake in SAF that Aaron mentioned has given the confidence to build. And we've seen it this year already. Prices have come off substantially because supply is ramping up. I would even say supply has been ramping up to such a point that it would even be possible to increase those mandates, to be more ambitious in the targets that we set ourselves than we have today.
Yeah, and I think this piece around risk is really important. It's a risk for a producer to go and spend hundreds of millions of dollars to build a new facility. It's a risk for an airline to go and add tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to your cost base and to build that in. But I think the biggest risk of all is if you have inaction. If you don't do anything to decarbonize, you face potentially much worse. Just as a tangible example that finally has started to emerge, last year in the Netherlands, the government decided to reduce the cap on how many flights were allowed to operate from Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. And the result of that was KLM, the home carrier there, had to all of a sudden go and look and say, well, with this in mind, we can't run our global network anymore. Some flights are going to have to reduce from 7 days a week to 6 or 5 days a week. And all of a sudden, these intercontinental connections that they're offering are broken. They're not possible anymore. And it can be a huge impact on their business. Now, that court decision or that government decision ended up getting overruled by a Dutch court, but that threat remains. If we don't take action voluntarily or regulatory, like we have going now, those implications could be far worse than just going and buying SAF. It could be, at some point you have to go and shrink your business by 100 aircraft and 10,000 employees, and that's a lot more costly.
Yeah, well, there's always a future-proofing part of the conversation as well, right? In addition to the commitments, just makes good business sense at the end, especially if you're facing that. I guess that's where regulation can play a role in helping speed up some of the transition that's happening. Haldane, how is the industry working with partners in governments to make sure that the transition can happen and that the regulations that are put in place can be met?
Yeah, so I think this comes from a couple of different angles. First and most important one is making sure that regulations, when they're put in, are sensible and not just an easy win for a government. It's very easy for a government to put a mandate in, for example. It's almost just one line of legislative text and then they've done their job. The reality is you need to be able to support the supply build-up as well as the demand side as well. So as we've seen in the United States, there is a lot of support for SAF production and for renewable energy production as well on the incentive side. That's not going to be able to take place everywhere. I think governments around the world can put in place incentives in different ways by encouraging production, encouraging construction, de-risking the investment in the process, but also taking part, particularly in developing economies, in multilateral processes, using places like the World Bank or regional development banks to help with blended finance to support the scale up in that sense. Because at the end of the day, this is not just an aviation story, it's an energy story, it's an energy security story for a lot of countries, and also a new economy story as well. At the moment, we have, I think, 90% of our fuel coming from 22 countries. SAF could be produced almost anywhere in the world and provide local green energy industries around the world as well. So there's a real opportunity that governments can look into there as well.
Yeah, Jeremy, that's a great point because it is a new industry, and the fact that it can be deployed anywhere is a very different situation. Are you having conversations around that? And is there dual use to this energy as well?
Yes, so absolutely. I strongly agree that this can become very local, but it can also be repurposing existing assets. So in the United States, a lot of petroleum refineries that were no longer economical have now been converted to renewable refineries. So you're converting grey jobs to green jobs in the same place, but you're reusing existing infrastructure. So I think that's very powerful. Some of the future technologies that I mentioned, they work on a hub and spoke basis. So you need lots of these local facilities to aggregate the feedstock, to make that product, to then convert it in sustainable aviation fuel at major hubs. So that is part of it. It is dual purpose because a lot of these refineries can also make renewable diesel. So they can play a role in decarbonizing road traffic today while preparing for decarbonized aviation in the future. So there is that play. As road electrifies, it gives the opportunity to have more going into the aviation because, well, aviation, it's going to be a long, long time before aviation electrifies.
I think that's great. So as we begin to wrap up, what is a message that you would like to leave the audience with? And I'm really struck, Aaron, when you were talking about the consumer element of it. That seems like the industry is aligned for the most part in making progress, but maybe the general public might be part of the equation that needs to come along too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do as an industry, is making it awareness for the public, but also making it actionable, right? There's certainly a huge number of airlines that have gone out, and we have, of course, customer engagement on it. For us, it's a big piece to go and have customers be able to engage with it and be able to make informed decisions at time of booking. Is this an airline that's using SAF? Is that SAF being used, in fact, at the airport I'm flying on? What are the emissions from that flight? Maybe could I shift even some of my flying to a flight an hour later? And that leads to differences. So there's lots of things, you know, data matters, but what matters is also actionable information coming from that data. So that's where we have to go in terms of engaging customers. We, of course, have to continue the work in scaling up the use of SAF, ultimately, to make it so that way some of these flights have real distinguishing and huge differences, in fact, versus others, too.
Listen, data doesn't work if you don't tell the story to consumers. And we talked briefly before this, and I logged my complaint that my only visibility of this was the box to pay more when I checked out after having already paid $1 million baggage fees. No offense to the great industry of airline. And so, I told them both that this is not landing well with probably the general, but if I had more information about the decision that I was making and the choice and a calculator of what sort of, you know, carbon footprint I was making. And, you know, we know this is probably will be soon available. So I think that's a great thing for you to all be thinking about, because it would affect my decisions more than the little tiny box I'm seeing right now. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done there. Haldane, closing thoughts from you? Yeah,
I think it's important to remember that we've talked about SAF completely in this panel, and it's a big topic and it's a real challenge. So don't let it, you know, the ease of the discussion and the enthusiasm that we've got underscore the fact that this is a really big challenge for us, let alone every other industry. But it's one part of the decarbonisation pathway that we're looking at as well in aviation. We're also looking at new technologies, things like hydrogen, potentially electric in the future as well for certain types of aircraft. Better operations, improvements in the way that we use our infrastructure, including air traffic management. So it's one part of the puzzle,
Airports
even though it's the big
themselves,
part of it.
I imagine,
Exactly,
as well.
exactly. But I would say also, particularly for a foreign policy, you know, informed audience like this on the global geopolitical discussion side, really making sure that we get the right policies in place in governments around the world to help support that transition, and with other stakeholder groups, finance sector, the energy sector as well, the traditional energy sector, they all need to come on board.
Fantastic. And Jeremy?
I would say the education and awareness. Because many people have probably flown here for this discussion, when you fly back, ask yourself the question, has your airline used SAF? Because it's possible to do it today, and it's a choice that you can do. If you go on, for example, on Google Flights, you can see the difference in CO2 emissions. Hopefully in the future, you'll also be able to see, hey, how much is the airline actually using in SAF to make my flying more sustainable for the future?
I think that's fantastic. And I'm encouraged listening to all of you talk about what's being done and the fact that the industry is coalescing around moving in this direction. It is difficult, but to know that it's happening and to be more educated about what that looks like will give me the power to make more informed choice as consumers. So I appreciate it, and I appreciate all the hard work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.